when I grow up, I will be smart enough to answer all the questions that you need to know the answers to before you're grown up.
After the masterpiece that was Wolfwalkers, it was surprising to see that Cartoon Saloon would come out with another movie just the following year, considering the usual 4 to 5 year gap. It makes a little bit more sense when you see that this was a collaboration with an American studio, and explained why it's not quite as good as Saloon's usual repertoire, and yet it still carries the potential to do emotional damage. In just the first 10 minutes, when the boy Elmer moves to the city with his mother, who tries to stay optimistic, but the stress of getting a job and trying not to get evicted causes her to lash out. Brutal for a child to not understand why even loving parents get mad and can't properly explain things and insist the child can't do anything to help. But Elmer believes that he can help when he hears about a dragon living on an island, and that he soon frees from imprisonment, but then every other animal on that island starts pursuing them because without the dragon, the island will soon sink into the sea. It's a genuinely rough and harrowing conundrum that they try to find a solution for, often fighting with animals that they are also trying to save. And in general, I do love the fairy tale logic of it, but while Luca and Dustin, Elmer and Boris, have their cute moments, they never quite form the credible friendship the movie tries to sell. Or rather, Boris at the beginning is kind of overbearing and shrill, and Elmer can be exhausting with his stubbornness to do things his way. And then we have another one of those climaxes where things happen because, including a third act breakup that feels like it is over nothing and lasts for about 30 seconds. The animation is still the same Cartoon Saloon style, but noticeably simpler than its other films, but it suits the storybook tone of the film, and still manages to be ethereal and beautiful. Elmer's a lot, but they are very believable actions for a child who is this desperate and terrified. It is my least favorite of what they've done so far, but I will always be looking forward to what they do next.
Bad, 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 bad boy.
We want it, and you're paying for it.
Mark your calendars, Illumination is ahead of 2 Disney films this year. Minions was always going to be a hit, as now it had been 12 years since the original Despicable Me came out, so now Minions has officially become nostalgia, and ergo critic-proof. But even for them, I think the real hook of this movie wasn't even the Minions, it was Baby Gru, to the point where I was a little disappointed that Gru himself, due to kidnapping, isn't in the movie more. After all, it's still a Minions movie, and the Minions have to take a significant part of the stage. And it's still Illumination Minions, where they do the things that you expect Minions to do, and as are depicted in the trailers, which indeed give away virtually every prominent scene that the Minions are in. But this is one of the few times where that might have actually worked in its favor. They show almost all the scenes with the Minions, but not any of the scenes with Gru, which ended up being the most surprisingly touching scenes between him and his idol, which aren't anything fancy, but considering the relationship with his mom, it actually made these scenes very touching. This really has hit me in a way that almost no other Illumination movie really has, and it is because of the way it made me feel for Gru. Even the moment in the finale where he's tied to the clock, despite being a super basic supervillain ploy, really got me because it sounded like he was legitimately in pain. The Minions are still themselves, and depending on your tolerance for Minion shtick, especially singing, it's still not anything incredible, and it still has some lapsed narrative choices, like Nefario working for Gru, literally only because he flashed puppy eyes at him and no other reason. That's very boring. But this movie did feel like Illumination was doing their usual Illumination thing, but in top form. The animation is definitely as good, if not better, than it's ever been. The physical comedy was funny. The voice acting was top tier. Generally, the characters across the board were fairly likable. I love the design of the Six and the journey of Wild Knuckles, the giant monster fight at the end, and even the training montage was funny because it's mostly Michelle Yeoh just beating up the Minions and making them miserable. I even want to give them credit for the very cool Bond opening credits, and the cute ending credit illustrations, and for crediting the animators before the cast. But I think that another factor why this feels so much better than the other Despicable Me films is because we don't have to deal with the rest of Gru's family. The girls are all okay in their introduction films, but afterward it feels like the writers don't really know what to do with them, so they just throw them these nothing subplots. That's something that needs to be fixed in the 5th film, which of course they will undoubtedly do. Oh wait, never mind. since I checked in on the DC animated films. Well, past its heyday, I think, the movies can certainly still be fun. Wanna watch Supergirl make out with Brainiac? But reviewing them started to feel a little fruitless since all of the feedback from fans on the movies from famous source material would pretty much all say that the adaptations were significantly lacking. But aside from Super Sons being a standalone, I had to continue the saga of is this Damian still a shitbag? Well, after his introductory line to Jonathan Kent of comparing his name to a toilet, 20 seconds later he tests his powers by pushing him down the Batcavern to his death. Ha! He's even more of a shitbag than he's ever been! And just as quickly, he's taken to task for his shitbagness by revealing that he has been voted out of becoming a Teen Titan because he is such a shitbag. I have literally never gotten on board with a Damian faster. Also, he is a cow.
You have a cow? Of course I have a cow.
I mean, it was pretty an overt story contrivance so the two sons would have something to bond over so quickly, except then they don't do that, so that was confusing. Instead, they bond over the other most logical thing they have in common, that isn't having famous superhero dads that have been taken over by Starmie. No, investigation. Damn it, they missed an opportunity to have them complain about their dads to each other. This movie does move at a bit of a brisk pace. Jonathan spends exactly 5 minutes in the "why didn't dad come to my ball game" before he reveals himself, and that's the end of that. The weak point is easily the CGI, which is perfectly suitable for the most of it except for the weird Superman baby and the straw, and occasionally is just a bit too stiff. I know, DC animation being stiff, perish the thought! But the action is still great, they have decent banter, and I generally like the two of them together. I would definitely be up for watching a follow-up of this. This might be my favorite DC film behind Batman's vs. Turtles. But I also have to mention DC Superhero Girls and Teen Titans Go Multiverse of Madness, but with a giant asterisk because it is a lie. This is not a crossover like they've done before. This is actually the DC Superhero Girls series finale, with TGG being shoved into the beginning and end in like one scene in the middle to justify putting their names on the title. And no, that's not speculation, they themselves admit that that's exactly what they're doing. I am glad most of us are past the point of calling TGG the worst thing to ever happen, but the one criticism that was always true was how it was overcrowding the CN schedule, pushing out other shows. Now it is literally invading other shows. I generally really like Superhero Girls, proving again that Lauren Faust is a gem and really knows how to make entertaining, fantastically animated, personality-filled female characters, even if half of them are reincarnations of FIM. And as a finale, it's really good as we see Wonder Woman gets recruited into the Justice League, but not the others. But this format makes both franchises look desperate and embarrassing.
Why do we build the wall? My children, why do we build the wall?
Finally, our Shudder exclusive. Mad God is a passion project 30 years in the making from visual effects guru Phil Tippett of RoboCop and Jurassic Park fame, and it is a jaw-dropping, grotesquely creative, stop-motion horror experience. The film opens with the destruction of the Tower of Babel and lines from Leviticus of a god loudly proclaiming his excessive eradication of all who defy him. A masked figure is lowered into a dystopian, abysmal wasteland filled with innovative, horrific creature designs, depraved acts of cruelty and despair, and bodily fluids. The first act gets pretty graphic. In fact, as much as I love my stop-motion horror, the first act of Mad God is almost too much for me. However, the second act, following a different figure, is much more bleakly atmospheric, and the last act is strange and psychedelic. That will take thought to uncover, and I will not lie and tell you that I have figured any of it out. It is certainly a skillful, unique, once-in-a-lifetime horror experience that is certainly worth at least an attempted glance to see how long you can last.
Every day it's getting a bit colder when I grow closer to the devil on my shoulder.
It's been a minute since Henry Selick graced us with his presence, though I did have to remind myself that just because it's Selick does not mean that it's Laika, as the last time it was both. Laika will be coming out this year with any luck. And followers will know that I have been waiting for this one for a while, and it is absolutely stunning. It's stylistic without feeling like it's just CG. I like the geometric paper designs of Wendell and Wild, which seems to represent the general supernatural style overall. It's a dark premise for a family film to have an orphan girl who summons two demons to resurrect her dead parents, and I would love to see the movie that is just those three characters, and also Raoul, as we have another case where there are too many characters to properly focus on the ones we actually need to. On top of diluting the cool premise with the incredibly basic, save the dilapidated town from the evil rich developers, only kept from being as boring as that sounds from their heinous tactics including murder and vote tampering via zombies. But that is emblematic of the film's fun and creepy ambition, resulting in quite a number of fantastically delivered scenes. From Kat's introduction to the school, the underworld amusement park, the first encounter with the demons, the stylistically gorgeous sequence where Kat confronts her past, the demons resurrecting the board members, really just any scene with Key and Peele in general, and almost every single thing Raoul does. These moments are certainly worth the price of admission alone, but the connections between these scenes are filled with fairly forgettable characters and story threads. Frustrating because the backstory of Sister Helly sounds fascinating enough to be its own movie, as a former demon summoner, but in this movie all she's doing is robbing the protagonist of her own agency by dragging her through her own arc. So this story's whole ended up being not quite as worth as the sum of its parts, but those parts are very good. It seems like we haven't gotten a lot from European animation this year. That, or they all came out in the later half and won't be released until after I upload. But you know there's going to be at least one from France, though the Annie-nominated Little Nicholas has still not been released. Charlotte is a biopic of a historical Jewish artist trying to study art in Germany during the rise of Nazism, while also navigating her various relationships, romantic and familial, that all come with their own sets of baggage, especially her grandfather showing just how hard it was in an age where people didn't have the knowledge or vocabulary to talk about mental health. For the most part, the movie feels just very typical biopic, but then there's a very dark turn regarding how loyal you should be to your family when they treat you like garbage, holding you back in every single way and really can't be helped. And it does end very abruptly, but then again, so does Charlotte's story. The animation is a bit basic and its pacing is a bit slow, but it showcases a lot of Charlotte's original art and doesn't shy away from the darker parts of her story. Now, the minute someone mentions an Anne Frank story set in the modern day with magical realism, that old meme about the Disney musical version of Anne Frank comes up, but this is pretty much in line with a lot of European films. And generally, the response has been positive, made by Ari Folman, who did Waltz with Bashir and The Congress. Boy, did that movie become prophetic in a short time! The movie's protagonist is Kitty, the imaginary friend that Anne was writing to in her diary, who manifests into a spirit in the modern day in Anne's house, which has now become a museum. She's invisible in the house, but becomes a real girl outside. This does feel a little fanficky when Kitty also finds a boy named Peter that she starts a relationship with, but it's very powerful watching Kitty slowly learn and come to realize what happened to Anne with the backdrop of Germany's current refugee crisis, revealing the true purpose of the film, how Anne's legacy has been deified in place of people actually learning from her story. It can be a little hokey, but it's mostly very effective, but more importantly reminds us that there's still a lot of work to be done.
Rocket Man, Rocket Man, burning on his fuse of Arizona.
Linklater's Apollo 10.5 opens as a fantasy of a young boy being recruited to be an astronaut, citing his worthy credentials as being good at kickball. Okay, yes, this is clearly a fantasy and not even really what the film is about. Rather, a reflection on the details of his boyhood life the year of the first moon landing. So it's a higher budgeted feature length of a YouTube animator's Draw My Life video of what life was like for middle-class America in Texas in the 60s. Meaning that it's a film that shows and explains, but doesn't really have a whole lot of plot or conflict. It's like glancing at the pages of a kid's diary. And that's not a slight because I love those videos. The choice for it to be animated was somewhat budget-oriented, but also to give that sense of airbrushed recollection and nostalgia. But it is a little confusing for there to be no real difference in the art style between his real life and his fantasies. Both of Linklater's previous rotoscoped films took much better advantage of the animated medium, though they do try to give some variety in the television programs in their color and resolution. Still, this is a very revealing and entertaining time capsule, delving into not just the physical culture of the technology and the food and how the kids spend their time. It does shed light on several of the less positive aspects at the time, but the bigger focus is the mindset around why the moon landing was such a big deal for the time that it was, reflected in the cutbacks to his astronaut fantasies, showing how it represented such optimism of the future and opened his childhood's imagination to possibilities in ways that we might barely be able to comprehend today. I mean, 6 kids and 1 parent working in the suburbs? Boy, that ain't coming back.
It's a real whodunit. A real whodunit. These are not in your stomach. A real whodunit.
Finally, we got the theatrical feature-length musical episode of Bob's Burgers we've been grinding our teeth for ever since the Disney-Fox merger blew this film's release into the void. And as a Bob's Burgers lover, I really enjoyed it. It was very Bob's Burgers, with that oh-so-lovable, monotone, wholesome, random tangent humor. However, what I was really looking forward to in this movie was the musical numbers, as Bob's Burgers is partially known for its really entertaining little jingles. And then it turns out that there's only 3 songs, and whatever Gene was doing at the end. Though I really liked Lucky Ducks, and the villain song is very funny, but it keeps fluxing between a song and a monologue, I'm just saying, Central Park has 3 songs per episode of collective superior quality. And highly annoying that the imagery used in their dream sequences is used to make the movie look a lot more exciting in the trailer. Given some of the places the episodes have gone, this movie really doesn't do anything too special aside from feature length and occasionally animating more frames and shadows. But even if it's just on par with a Bob's Burgers episode, it is a very entertaining one. Luis-centered episodes do tend to be the best, and Detective Luis episodes are even better, as they investigate the dead body found outside of their restaurant pretty much because Louise wants to prove that she's not a baby, which is a very Louise motive. Certainly plenty of solid comedy when the kids are investigating, and Sergeant Bosco is always a riot. I always could just watch a full hour of just the kids talking, and then it has a very exciting and emotionally resonant finale. This might have been a little short of the hype and anticipation, but it was a very satisfying and rewatchable movie.
Huge sail that'll hold the squalls and a big black ship with some cannonballs. Don't wanna join Davy Jones 20,000 leagues under the sea.
Leave it to a former Disney director to show Disney how a proper adventure story is done. Sea Beast opens with an incredible sea battle and an oddly mature premise that looks like it could be up there with any live-action period drama. Then it turns into a marauded 2-person film, semi-reenacting How to Train Your Dragon. And also, I think somebody at Way of Water might have copied this movie's homework. But as someone who tends to roll their eyes at most child escort mission stories, I really like these two. They challenge each other really well. Still, as someone who really likes seafaring stories, I really do wish the vibe of the first act had continued a bit more, which did a great job of introducing us to a world and a history and characters that I was really interested in seeing more of, with the bond between Captain Crow and Lawrence, and the first mate clearly has a story. And we do get some of that, presenting the characters with a quandary that puts previous allies at odds and being reflective on the world that they think that they know. I just wish we could have done that with slightly more multi-character interactions and spending more time on the ship. We also continue that trend in children's media that tries to deal with a very real-world issue that is mutually somewhat admirable, but also just makes me feel like it's a lie to tell kids that this very complex issue can be dealt with this easily. Not that it's the movie's job, just it subsequently gets more and more depressing each time. But overall, I really liked this film, and glad that we're potentially getting sequels. There's a lot of potential here.
Come your legacy, promise me a place in your house of memories.
Not just stop motion, 22 was a decent year for horror anthologies as well. As the very first movie that came out that year, The House is really 3 short horror stories, all assumedly taking place in one house throughout its history, taking on a different genre that's associated to the story's time in its history. Probably. The first is a gothic horror around a family given the opportunity to live in an extravagant house, but something's not quite right about the place. The second is a Lynchian disturbing creature feature of a developer dealing with a particular pest problem that will unnerve people with both bug and social anxieties. And the last is a more personal existential apocalypse that may barely qualify as horror, but does have a unique turn in terms of who you should be sympathizing with. Again, set off my social anxieties. Though all three are quite mind-bending, I'm partial to the first because I like old haunted house stories and the unease of exploring in the dark. The connections and meaning of the stories is all up for interpretation, but at its most basic, all three stories involve the owners, all in financially difficult positions, thinking that the house is the key to their happiness, the answer to their problems, but their fixation becomes its own poison, and eventually defines the horrors that they encounter. Of course, it's also just funny to think that these are stories written by someone getting irritated with their own personal housing project to the point of saying that their home is cursed, or just anxiety from the housing market. Period. You can't be a proper adult if you don't own a house, says predatory loan sharks. And it's interesting how they've picked their subjects for each of these stories. The first are human-like, but also craft-like in appearance, giving the impression of dolls in a dollhouse. The mouse's story is dealing with pests, but mice are also technically pests. And the cat? Not 100% sure, honestly, maybe it's something about a water-based apocalypse? There is always more to examine beneath the surface, and I look forward to other people's interpretation, but just on its surface, this is just great stop-motion horror.
That we'll find one another in that big somewhere out there.
The first time, I believe, the Academy is recognizing an animation hybrid, also the award show that actually matters. Based on a series of viral videos, Marcel is this adorable little sentient shell with his grandmother making a documentary about their lives, how they get food, travel from place to place, but focusing on trying to find the rest of their family as they've suddenly disappeared. Thankfully, the answer to that is not tragic, though this movie is not devoid of tragedy. It's easy to get invested in the bizarre and adorable details of how Marcel lives his life. Bit by bit, Marcel starts to learn how big the world really is, in ways that are fascinating, confusing, and even disappointing. You can imagine social media has a lot to do with that. Marcel as a whole is very cute and quite funny, as he points out a lot of life's absurdities, but also relaxing and quietly introspective on life's simple pleasures and what we really need to be fulfilled, which largely consists of genuine connection. And I love all the shell character designs, and it does affirm that stop motion, at least as a hybrid, works better the simpler and less human the character is, which is why it works with Legos so well. Shonen Jump filler movies can be fun, but they're hardly ever a match for the other movies of a year, largely because of their formulaic apocalyptic-level threats that no one seems to ever remember. One Piece, the #1 selling comic run on the entire planet, has been largely no different, but something about the exploratory nature of its world makes even filler content feel like it's expanding the world, and not just spinning everyone's wheels. I also think it's because post-time skip, Oda has stacked all of his new arcs with stadiums filled with new characters that it feels like we never get enough time with our beloved usual Straw Hat crew. So sometimes I'm grateful for filler just to give us more time with them. As a result, I've genuinely liked a lot of the One Piece movies, but by far my favorite is movie 6, not just because it's directed by one of my personal favorite directors, Mamoru Hosoda, it's because it's a horror movie. But Red has given 6 a run for its money. It's made a big difference that Oda himself was more involved with this film than any of the others, including the script process. And the briefest description of the movie's hook that doesn't involve any knowledge of One Piece: the world's biggest pop star uses her concert and supernatural powers to trap her fans in an alternate dimension, as well as releasing an ancient demon to save the world from piracy. People object to this plan. The character of Uta is certainly one of the most memorable original characters for a One Piece film. Devil Fruit, where she can warp reality with her songs, a power that allows this movie to be both visually vibrant and bizarre, so very on brand, as well as a good musical, in the rare variant where songs are diegetic, as Uta covers multiple genres reflecting her mindset and intentions, covering classic pop, power ballads, angry swing, to ominous opera. And this makes it more than the other Shonen Jump action fest by breaking up the action with music and character drama as we delve into Uta's past and psyche. Unfortunately, her anti-piracy stance isn't a chance for Luffy to process or defend his childlike dream of being king of the pirates against the reality of the violence of piracy, because in reality, this stand is more about Uta being angry at her pirate dad, which is ultimately underwhelming because turns out it was all a misunderstanding, which is not my favorite dramatic turn. Even so, it had a spectacular climax with the unexpected bonus that Usopp does a thing, like a prominent character step in his journey. I'd say that this could work for non-One Piece fans given the emphasis on an original character, but it still contains an awful lot of One Piece's existing characters, which newcomers wouldn't know, not Stampede levels, but enough to be disorienting. Character overhaul seems to be this year's main sin. Definitely a new contender for best of the One Piece movies, but 6 is probably still my favorite.
Baby, you can kiss all your childhood traumas goodbye. You're never gonna miss all that stress you've been keeping inside.
Hey, you remember the beginning of the year there was all that fuss about the art style, and 13-year-olds don't act like this, and that box that's in every single grocery store in the country? All for a cute and fluffy animal transformation coming-of-age parental strife film, which family movies do literally all the time. The whinging did eventually die down because at the end, turning red was a solidly sweet and funny experience. I don't blame others for not connecting to the boy band fanaticism. I mean, I was there at that time and that didn't do too much for me. Even thinking that its period metaphor doesn't completely fit, but certainly works better as more general puberty symbolism, or better yet, attributes or even values passed down through the generations, changing in perception with the times. May is a very relatable teen character who is absolutely adorable with her friends, who I also love, but it's her relationship with her mom that's impressively handled. This is another generational struggle, but this time May and her mom actually get along quite well, but now she wants to grow in a direction that she's afraid her mother doesn't want. And seeing the similar strife with her own mother speaks volumes. And this leads to what I think is one of recent Disney's strongest finales, being surprising, funny, and musically epic. But again, the quick, snappy animation does a lot of the heavy lifting in this film, with a ton of great expressions and comedic timing. And hopefully at some point Disney will re-release all of its Disney Plus Pixar premieres in theaters finally, so we can really show off what the animation can do. I have considered this my number one just to F with people, but Rise of the TMNT is easily the second best TMNT movie, and even giving 1990 a run from its money if you're not banking on nostalgia. As I said in my elongated video on the series, I understand the aggressive response when Rise was announced, because I was a 2012 simp and I was with them. And many who commented on that video agree. One of the biggest issues with Rise was that it was announced way too soon after 12 ended, and we were not ready. Especially since the series did some very different things with the characters. For many fans, it was just a bit of a culture shock. This series really did grow on me. In fact, it might actually be my favorite series now. Especially when I saw its premature finale, released 4 episodes of the graded animated stuff that has ever existed. So much so that this movie might not even match it. But it certainly tried, and unlike the finale, you don't actually need to have seen the series to watch it. Only that Raph and Leo's roles have switched as the leader and the impulsive loner, except Leo is also 2003 Mikey. But can you say flex? This was making Red nervous. Anime-style fighting is distilled and paced with quick moments of tension and character moments, but doesn't drag. This is basically the structure of a Shonen Jump filler movie, but just done to virtual perfection. The Krang are the most horrifying they have ever been in anything. Some people would say that a different magenta-tinged antagonist wins for Irredeemable Monster of the Year, and they are wrong because it's the Krang. But even when the action is the obvious highlight, part of why it's gathered at the base that it has is because it does some of the most interesting things with the 4 brothers. Because unlike all of the other films, this genuinely tries to give each of the brothers a significant moment, leading up to one of the most extreme emotional climaxes of the entire year and the history of this franchise. I understand people still being ambivalent of Rise, but I very much encourage giving this movie a try. If there is one thing everyone agrees on, is that the animation is fire, and that this Donnie is best Donnie. And again, if you want me to talk about 2012, I will.
Officer Krupke were very upset. We never had the love that every child ought to get. We ain't no delinquents, we're misunderstood. Deep down inside us there is good. There is good.
I'm surprised how Bad Guys has been unable to get any nominations considering how generally well it was received. But then again, it's not like it cracked my top 3, which shows exactly how good this year has been, considering I would have been okay with half of my list getting some sort of nomination. Bad Guys was the first shot fired, signaling that DreamWorks had taken their mild hiatus to up their game and were coming to play with their shiny new CGI 2D hybrid art to complement their usual talent for sharp comedic animation. It takes its frequent trend of villain-hero subversion by featuring the villain animals from every fairy tale and making them into criminals. These characters just absolutely pop with their humor, with their designs, with their antagonistic tsundere friendship, as it makes fun of heist films while being a solid heist film. Its biggest issues are likely just that its twists are predictable, which isn't really something I give movies a ton of grief for anymore, or that certain characters just don't match the appeal and the presence of the rest. Though I have a slightly bigger beef with story elements like the viral clip that makes them good guys is basically nothing, and possibly wanting more of the characters' backstories. But that's a case where you don't know where they would have put that without mussing up this movie's pacing when it's otherwise very sleek and tight. The message is positive, especially given other current stories about villain redemptions, but this is just a case of classic animation and comedy just being completely on point.
And we played the first thing that came to our heads. Just so happened to be the best song in the world. It was the best song in the world.
I've generally liked Masaki Yuasa, though little of his works have been personal favorites. Inuo, directly translated as King of the Dogs, might actually have gotten there. A blind biwa player and a cursed child who could be an ancestor of the double-elbowed people, who is nonetheless an exquisite and versatile dancer, team up to become the greatest performers in the Heike period. For about half of its runtime, Inuo is basically a concert playing their songs and dances to completion from start to finish, animated them as realistically as possible, drawing direct visual connections to classic music movements like 70s rock, Beatlemania, Elvis, opera, ballet, rhythm gymnastics. See, even when he's going for more realism, he's still pushing absurdity and exaggeration. I like how it still tries to frame these performances as though they totally could have happened at this time, with fireworks and even projections, except that the biwa player is backed by an electric guitar, so it's very Knight's Tale in that way. But these are absolutely fantastic showcases of animation, music, and choreography. But I could have done without the close-ups of Tomo's mouth. But the purpose behind all of this music is more than just comedy. Inuo can hear the voices of dead samurai spirits whose stories have been the basis for their songs. And unsurprisingly, a lot of them died doing pointless wars and errands for their rich asshole bosses, including how Tomo lost his sight. These stories challenge the sovereignty and flawlessness of their leaders, and seeing how popular they become, those leaders become very motivated to shut them down. So yeah, in a year where we actually got quite a number of Eat the Rich stories, this one technically fits in, except that it ends slightly more realistically. As much as these performances seem ridiculous, the entire point is, hey, we don't know that the Heike period didn't have water ballet, because the bastards in charge silenced art and voices of those that threatened them or they just personally didn't like. Can't imagine how that's relevant.
Love doesn't discriminate between the sinners and the saints. It takes and it takes and it takes, and we keep loving anyway. We laugh and we cry and we break and we make our mistakes.
Despite being intended as a series, Kid Cudi's Intergalactic works perfectly well as a film. Its runtime being exactly movie length, goes through a lot of the beats of a standard romantic comedy, and it's certainly not the only film to divide itself into chapters. I suppose it's possible this was meant to go further and it got cut a bit short. The ending sorta gives that implication, but ultimately the only way that that's a problem is that this movie missed out on getting considered as a nomination for this year, which is a massive shame. In either case, as someone who's not all that into romantic comedies, this one was delightful. It is structured in a fairly episodic way, as the approach to the characters is very grounded. It's really just watching two and more characters go about their lives, meet, start a relationship, talk to their friends about it, and have relationship issues in a very believable way that isn't trying to build itself up and contort itself around the regular 3-act structure. It just feels very real, Admittedly idealized, but very mature. People looking at this and thinking Spider-Verse, this is not for kids. There's naked people in this. But the real spice of this movie isn't even just the stunning Spider-Verse street art visuals. It's the unique, non-diegetic animation flares and segments of Jabari's imagination, and its different animation styles when their friends tell stories of their own romantic tales. All this with the backdrop of Kid Cudi's music. Gorgeous, it's romantic, it's funny, it has vibes for days. My only note is the dropped frame rate as a stylistic choice is something I universally approve. Just occasionally, sometimes here, it drops so low that it looks like it's buffering. And the effect of this is even worse if you're watching this on one of those 4K 60 FPS screens. Please, please stop rendering things in 4K 60. And minor nitpick is that this movie does throw shade on dating apps. And while it is true that a lot of those apps are used for data mining, my sister did meet her fiance on a dating app, so she did not appreciate that. Seriously, this movie is astounding. Kid said he wanted to make more of these, and absolutely please. But he better move quick. Netflix is canceling pretty much everything animated at this point. Man, Dragon Prince is really lucky that it grabbed that 4-season deal early.
We'll soon find out, because we're going to go
To the wishing star, to the wishing star. Something weird and so bizarre, it fell to earth from way afar. They're on their way to the wishing star.
It's pretty much a cliche at this point to point out how nobody knew that Puss in Boots 2, of all things, was going to be this good. I did admit that the trailer looked good, but before, never really saw Puss as anything more than the Zorro but a cat gimmick he was designed to be. Admitting I haven't seen the show, but this is the first time we've really gotten into his character in a deep way. A swashbuckling hero who's gotten so caught up in his ego and his own mythology that his reality check terrifies him so much that he can't be himself. Everything about this movie just works. The pacing, balancing action and character, balancing comedy with character introspection. It's funny without losing the darkness and severity of its plot. That every single frame is a painting. Every single scene is shot so stunning and clever and colorful. But the special ingredient, other than its sheer beauty at every turn, is its approach to classic Shrek's fairy tale mockery and subversion, without delving into any modern reference humor. No tweeting jokes here. There's Goldie and the Three Bears, looking basically like a twisted princess sketch, but turned out to be an incredible emotional gut punch that wrought way more emotional damage than Puss. And the best villain since the Godmother in Big Jack Horner, who deliberately spits in the face of most redeemed villain stories. And gonna say it, best Jiminy of the year. And then, the Wolf. That perfect dose of nightmare fuel nearly every great family movie needs. His presence is thematically perfect, and again, a reveal that most people knew was coming but does not hinder the enjoyment of the character for even a second. But seriously, this is one of the most action-packed, violent kid movies in a while. It's amazing. The only mild negative I've ever heard is that the dog can sometimes be annoying, with his voice and his mannerisms seem to very much trying to invoke Olaf, including pushing his perpetual positivity in the face of misery and death even further. By the end, his existence is absolutely crucial to the film, but there are a couple of scenes where they could have pulled him back just a tad. Great action, great use of pre-existing characters, fantastic use of fantasy. Visually, this is one of DreamWorks' all-time best. It is an instant classic, and proving that they are still almost flawless in the sequel game. But I am also glad that I watched it before the hype started snowballing. People who saw it later will have to tell me if that infected their enjoyment.
Papa, can you hear me? Papa, can you help me not be frightened? Looking at the skies, I seem to see a million eyes. Which ones are yours?
3 things are guaranteed when you grow up. 90% of everything you know you will unlearn, that you will die, and that every single Disney film you've ever encountered was rooted in an incredibly dark and effed up story. I guess that overlaps with the first thing. Del Toro has been wanting to make a Pinocchio story since forever. That while totally capturing some of the darkness of the original story, including that Pinocchio survives multiple murder attempts, he opted for his own version. In his version, Geppetto already has a son and then loses him in the war. Then, out of grief and alcohol, tries to remake him out of wood, animating the scene like a scene out of Frankenstein, and then Geppetto being terrified when it actually comes to life.
Alive! I'm a boy and I'm alive!
reflected in his still adorable but slapdash, jagged, unrefined design. Those broken nails never get fixed. They are there the whole time. I wouldn't know where to start comparing this to the Disney classic, and largely there would be no point, but I do know that this is my favorite Pinocchio character from any adaptation. Sorry, Paul Rubens. He embodies all of the multiple shades of being a child, including the selfishness, the rambunctiousness, the mischievousness, and the immaturity, not just the innocence. And did we mention replacing Pleasure Island with being forcefully recruited into the army? And they ultimately never even promised to be a real boy in the literal sense, more a metaphorical sense of being accepted as Geppetto's son. The Blue Fairy is more of a fantastical creature out of Pan's Labyrinth, Monstro is more of a monstrous hybrid of deep-sea fish, and I like Ewan McGregor's Cricket, though he does sometimes have a case of saying the subtext out loud syndrome. The stop motion, without question, is some of the most beautiful animation that has been made in years. And less appreciated is how this is another musical. But it's barely noticeable because that's how well the songs are woven into the story, and don't last too long. Especially the one where he sings to his papa, which tragically did not get an original song nomination. Oh well, I guess they'll have to settle for clearing out every single Best Animated Film award. But boy did we appreciate that nobody endorsed the legitimacy of animation as an art form like Del Toro, who already has started on another animated film, and thank goodness. So that was 2022, finally done with. Go ahead and tell me what your worst to best list was, and what are you looking forward to for next year? And okay, we already know about Spider-Verse, what else are you looking forward to?
So this is the end of the movie. Whoa, whoa, whoa. But real life isn't a movie. No, no, no. You want things to be wrapped up neatly, the way that stories do. You're looking for answers, but answers aren't looking for you. Because life is a gradual series of revelations that occur over a period of time. It's not some carefully crafted story. It's a mess and we're all gonna die. If you saw a movie that was like real life, you'd be like, what the hell was that movie about? It was really all over the place. Life doesn't make narrative sense